Gospel timeline proven reproducible. Matthew's 4 displaced blocks. Synoptic problem proven revealed. In this reading of my journal article, I'll be referring to this poster I created in the fall of 2000. There are only 4 blocks of Matthew that are out of order. This is the first one. Here's the second one. It goes there. The third one goes right below that, and this fourth one goes right below that. Very simple to solve the harmony of the Gospels, which is somewhat scandalous in the scholarly community because of what they call the synoptic problem. So this is entitled Gospel Timeline Proven Reproducible, Matthew's 4 Displaced Blocks. I just showed it to you. The synoptic problem proven revealed. Just so you know, super quick, they call it a problem that Luke always agrees with Mark, and that Luke never agrees with Matthew against Mark. See, but because, I'm telling you now, because Luke is intentionally affirming Mark, that is a problem for liberal scholarship. Because now we do have the true timeline, proven and reproducible. Luke intentionally gave us that timeline by intentionally affirming Mark's chronology. They call it a problem. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptics, the synoptic problem. It's a problem for them. It's our solution, that Luke affirms Mark's chronology. I have extensive credentials not to be named here. And here is the reading. Gospel timeline proven reproducible, Matthew's 4 displaced blocks, synoptic problem proven revealed, Michael Pigon. Introduction. The digital information age of the 1990s popularized personal computing, the easy organization of data. The Gospels as literary data are easily organized as blocks of text onto an electronic spreadsheet, and the result is gospel harmonization. The 2,000-year-old conundrum of harmonizing Matthew, Mark, Luke, John is finally solved. This article introduces the true timeline of Jesus' ministry. It does so by briefly covering the tradition of gospel harmonization, then the reproducible method of proving gospel harmonization, then the identification of Matthew's 4 displaced blocks. The article also proves and reveals the synoptic problem, that Luke affirms Mark's chronology against Matthew, and that Matthew, Mark, Luke are isolated to 3 measurable clusters. I have a 30-foot poster in my Jeep. In that 30-foot poster of the Gospels, you can see that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all contribute the same material, not throughout all the Gospels, not sporadically throughout the Gospels, but on 3 isolated measurable clusters. So on a 30-foot poster, you see here's a cluster, and here's a cluster. And that cluster is where all 3 synoptics are contributing the same material, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So that is what the 3 clusters means. Finally, that Matthew, Mark, Luke text variation is consistent with the scenario of the ancients, that Levi had taken notes in the language of the Hebrews, and these notes were sourced by Mark. Matthew's Greek gospel was published in an orderly, albeit disheveled state. So Luke resolves the matter of chronology, for he affirms Mark's narrative from beginning to end, that is, orderly account. Tradition. Since the time of 2nd century Tatian, students of the Gospels attempt to align the content of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John in order to read Jesus' ministry as narrative. Although the Gospels portray Jesus' story chronologically, with time and place stamps from beginning to end, sequential from baptism through to ascension, it was not until the view achieved by my spreadsheet format that the 4 easily identifiable displaced blocks of Matthean text were identified, which I have been chronicling since 2000. I am surpassing footnotes. All of my work is extensively footnoted. I'm not reading those in this reading. In the history of gospel harmonization and timeline, Westcott's unsubstantiated claim that there is too much content in John 3 and 4 for Jesus to have attended Pentecost as John 5, unfortunately set in motion wide conjecture and criticism regarding the identity of John's unnamed festival, John 5. with the prolific Westcott convoluting the content of John 3 and 4, the impressionable and influential Brodus mistakenly and unfortunately negated the value of identifying the feast, negated the possibility of identifying the feast, and negated the chronology of the synoptics. Although Brodus is mistaken on all three of these points, his harmony of the Gospels unfortunately popularized the mistaken notion of a 3-year ministry. And what I'm talking about there is the second of only 2 important things you have to do to prove the harmony. The first thing you have to do to prove the harmony, as I always have been saying for 2 decades, is identifying these 4 displaced blocks of Matthean text. The other thing you have to do is identify this festival right here in John chapter 5. So that's what I'm talking about right there. And that's what I explored on the scholarly level at Azusa Pacific University for my second master's. And that's what we call the festival of John chapter 5. When you hear me say the festival of John 5, I'm talking very early in the ministry, right here in John, this unnamed festival, John chapter 5. With the advent of personal computing in the 1990s, however, the method of organizing the Gospels as data on a spreadsheet readily reveals that only 4 blocks of Matthean text need to be relocated, aligned with their corollaries in Mark and Luke, for Gospel harmonization. For Mark and Luke agree aligned chronologically, except for Luke 8:19-21. That's just 3 verses in Luke that do not align with Mark from beginning to end. Leave John 5 festival subsequent to preceding Johannine storyline, that is, John 2 through 5 as sequential. Leave all this as sequential, John 2 through 5. Just leave it alone. And Matthew, Mark, Luke, John each tell the integrative, sequential, relationship by relationship, season by season story of Jesus' ministry. John's festival cycle provides annual seasons, winter, spring, summer, fall. So as you know, my posters, this one, which was my preeminent work in 2000, it does not have the seasons. A week after developing this, I was able to just put the seasons. Winter, spring, summer, fall. Winter, spring, summer, fall. Now those are available as posters, booklets for all age groups. Method. The method of harmonizing the Gospels is easily and empirically reproduced on a home computer. Simply align Gospel section headings of a reputable New Testament. Example, Nelson New King James Version, inserting publisher's section headings into cells from top to bottom as a spreadsheet in View. Again, open a blank electronic spreadsheet. Example, Excel. Designate 4 columns, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Insert section headings. Example, Peter's mother-in-law is healed. Many healed after the sunset. That material is right here in Mark and Luke. Section headings. Just put them on a spreadsheet. Align the headings with their corollaries in the other Gospels where they naturally align without relocation and View. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John align from top to bottom of the spreadsheet, beginning to end of their Gospels, except for 4 easily identifiable, very orderly displaced blocks of Matthean text. It's that simple. John's festival cycle provides the seasons of Gospel narrative, never seen before harmony of the Gospels. Pigon, 2000 to present. Today is July 18th, 2020. This work is 20 years old. Matthew's 4 displaced blocks. Because I achieved gospel harmonization 20 years ago, Pigon 2000 to present, I have been proving and expanding my work since then. Objections are easily handled because the whole matter is elementary. The Gospels were written chronologically, so their narrative is easy to prove, and ancient scholarship attests to the scenario that explains how this could have happened. Levi had written logia, that is, sayings, as the events occurred. Mark sourced those notes. Published Greek Matthew is out of order in 4 easily identifiable blocks of text, as if pieces of parchment had been displaced during handling. Luke examines and resolves the matter of gospel narrative. He affirms Mark's orderly account. This paper is actually almost over. It's a short paper. I'll read this page and then just a bit on the next page when we're already done. I'll read super quick. A recent objection from the Lockman Foundation to my harmonization is that a supposed proto-Matthean Hebrew gospel, sourced by Mark, compromises divine inspiration. That Mark cannot be divinely inspired if he is looking at Matthew's Hebrew gospel. Here's what the ancients said. Papias, Irenaeus, and Origen reported Matthew as having produced his gospel in the language of the Hebrews. This matter is easily resolved in the conservative posture by clarifying the scenario. Mark is not looking at a published Matthew Hebrew gospel. Rather, tax collector Levi wrote the sayings or logia of Jesus as the events occurred in the lingua franca of the Hebrews, namely Hebraic. Mark sourced Levi's notes. Matthew is understood traditionally to have provided his own Greek gospel. As you familiarize with gospel narrative, you will see that Levi, the tax collector, is called just 3 pericopes after the Sermon on the Mount. It's as if he worked his way into a job as chronicler. Jesus called him. The 12 are named a while thereafter. Levi of Capernaum was picked up early. So Levi, the tax collector, was here very early in the ministry at the Sermon on the Mount. He was writing the notes. He's being a chronicler, a biographer of Jesus. Jesus calls him to himself right after that. The 12 are not named until after that. So it's as if Levi, who gave us the Gospel of Matthew, it's as if Levi had worked himself into a position as an apostle by chronicling. He was taking notes in the lingua franca. Hi, Quinn. How's it going? The 4 easily identifiable displaced blocks of Matthean text are pictured as an appendix. The principle of multiple witnesses established by Moses, Jesus, Paul, and repeated in Hebrews gives us biblical permission to read those 4 anachronous blocks of text according to where they occur in Mark and Luke. For Luke affirms Mark against Matthew, which is the synoptic problem. The synoptic problem proven. Hi, Sophia. How's it going? I'm just reading my paper. Welcome back to Colorado. Harmony of the Gospels, Pigon 2000 to present, and Pigon Translation Apparatus 2018 to present, prove the synoptic problem, and this includes scientific evidence for the development of the Gospels. Mark sources Levi, Matthew's disheveled Gospel, Luke affirms Mark, and John's festivals harmonize with Matthew, Mark, Luke. We have the true timeline of Christ's ministry, so therefore we have a translation apparatus. My translation apparatus is presently a 6-story high spreadsheet. Since I align gospel duplicate accounts appropriately, sequentially. Hey, welcome back, Colorado.
Thank you. How are you doing, Mike?
Good, Chris.
Good to see you.
Good to see you, sir. Since I align gospel duplicate accounts appropriately, sequentially, I compare textual nuances among the synoptics. When I printed an abbreviated version, 30-foot poster, I am the first to discover that Matthew, Mark, Luke are isolated to 3 clusters of the gospel story. The first cluster, naturally, is where Luke addresses Matthew. So I could or should have the 30-foot poster here, and then you'd see, oh, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're all telling the same stories, only in 3 clusters. They don't do it throughout all the Gospels, and they don't do it sporadically. And so that means that Luke is intentionally covering that material where Matthew is displaced, and Luke is intentionally and consciously affirming Mark's chronology. It's very simple to prove. It's poster format, though, so that's part of the challenge of communicating all this. The 3 isolated clusters of the synoptic problem, the macroscopic view. Have you ever wondered where the synoptic problem scholars do their work? So far, they've been all over the map, lost in the trees. That's because they hadn't known which pericopes go where in the narrative, or which pericopes are duplicated, that is, like accounts, and which are similar, that is, similar but different. The first cluster of Matthew, Mark, Luke is actually where Luke affirms Mark against Matthew's 4 displaced blocks. So you can view the first cluster. So in this paper, I have the little synopsis chart. Let's see if I can show it to you real quick. My work always has extensive appendices, and I validate and prove and show everything very simply. This work is actually very elementary. Okay, so here's the last page, and then to close. The second cluster is 2 seasons later, summer. The third cluster, 2 seasons later, at late winter, in the first couple days of Passion Week. Macroscopically, there's only these 3 clusters. And the last bit, the translation apparatus, the pericopes, and the synoptic problem, microscopic view. Pigon Translation Apparatus 2018 easily organizes and counts pericopes. And these are pericopes. Pericopes are just little sections, individual stories within the Gospels. So Peter's mother-in-law is healed is an example of a pericope that's 2 verses long. When Jesus healed Peter's mother, that little story is called a pericope. So that's what these are. That's how scholars we organize our work sometimes as pericopes. Can you see that? Peter's mother-in-law is healed, many healed after Sabbath sunset. That's a pericope. That's what a pericope is. My counting method is still being standardized, but consistently, Mark has less than half the amount of unique stories of both Matthew and Luke. This makes sense, for Mark sourced Levi's notes, then Matthew wrote his Greek Gospel, then Luke's prologue and Gospel. There are about 50 shared pericopes identified for synoptic comparison. Luke affirms the content, Jesus' stories, of the others, and affirms Mark's narrative and fills in details. Luke shares few pericopes with Matthew individually and Mark individually, which is evidence for the synoptic problem that he intentionally addresses Mark-Matthew content, then writing what interests him. Example, the 3 southward journeys to Jerusalem for festivals, while Mark and Matthew are silent. If you can believe this, I'm going to show you, it's kind of windy out here, I'm going to show you what's very obvious in poster format that scholarship doesn't even know, that here's a Jesus traveling in Luke to attend a festival in John. Here's Jesus traveling in the Gospel of Luke to attend a festival that's in the Gospel of John. Matthew and Mark are silent over here. Here's Jesus traveling from north to south to attend the festival in Jerusalem. Poster format shows very clearly, very easy and elementary gospel content that for 2,000 years people have not discovered, and it's because of the technology of the spreadsheet. Okay. The prolific bell curve of unique and shared pericopes is evidence that Mark published first, then Matthew, then Luke. Because Mark sourced Levi, he translated as best he could, per the ancients, and Mark is the epitomizer of Matthew, more recently noted. So that's scholarly language, that Mark is the epitomizer of Matthew. All that means is Mark is looking at Matthew, who is called Levi. He's looking at his notes, and he gives an abbreviated version of Matthew's fuller work. So they say that Mark is the epitomizer of Matthew. That's what they're saying. Is Mark wrote an abbreviated, shorter version of Matthew. That's what they're saying. Gospel text is easy examined in Pigon translation apparatus. Pigon 2018 to present. The synoptics both share textual similarities, though vary more often. This makes sense because Levi wrote first, then the others translated as best they could per the ancients. If Mark is actually clumsy Greek, as some say, his sourcing of Levi's Hebraic notes accounts for that. If Matthew really is an original Greek text, not translated, that also makes sense, since his notes are his own. And did Mark and Peter return Levi's non-paginated tax collector Hebraic notes to him wholly, completely, and in fair condition? So the last bit is me kind of being funny there, because they say that the Gospel of Mark is really Peter's Gospel. That Peter and Mark worked together to give us the Gospel of Mark. And when we look at this poster, we see that there is literary dependence between Matthew and Mark. Okay, because they start and stop at the same places so often that you're looking at that and you're going, these guys, somebody's looking at the other person, so that there's literary dependence. So now we know that if it's true that Peter helped Mark write the gospel, if that's true, that they are looking at Levi's Hebraic notes. And so my last line says, now did they return Levi's notes to him wholly, completely, and in fair condition? See? Because Matthew's out of order sequentially in exactly 4 blocked areas. Area code 626-327-2516. Give me a call between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. anytime in the USA, presently in Colorado.